countries. So I appreciate you all turning out today. I'm going to send around my usual sign-up list, which I have to turn into the university because this is a university-funded seminar. And I should also mention that we are also very grateful for the grant that we've received from the Center for International Business Education and Research, who has helped us bring Professor Spiro here today to talk. But I'll pass around the sign-up sheet. If you wouldn't mind giving me your name and your email address if you'd like to be added on to the Diaspora listserv. If you're already on, or know that you're on, and don't worry about putting your email address on, but please do sign in nonetheless. Thank you. Welcome.
Thanks, Lizelle. Thanks for having me, and thanks to all you for showing up. I know it's busy competing with the new president out here at the university, but so, and I'm glad to have a chance to revisit this subject myself. As Lizelle mentioned, this paper has been published. It came out of the NYU Law Review last year. And so, citizenship is my general interest, and this has a little piece of it, and so it's good to have a chance to revisit one's own writing, because one doesn't always have an excuse to do that. So, I'm also going to use you as a guinea pig. This is the first time I've used PowerPoint. It's not nearly as pervasive in the legal academy as it is in the social sciences. So. Apologies in advance if it doesn't click quite right. I had my 10-year-old daughter helping me out. It's incredible. They actually learn. Kids now she's in 5th grade. So last year she was given a PowerPoint lesson.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
And, but I removed the little clown smiley faces. So anyway, so this is a paper about what I and some others call external citizenship, and I'm not sure to what extent that's the common parlance yet in other disciplines. So, I assume that you all are coming. You're not from law, I know. So, I'll look forward to being informed by you all coming at this from other disciplines. And in law, this is. I wouldn't say it's, well, in some ways it is marginal. I mean, there are very few people in the legal academy who are addressing these kinds of questions, or at least this specific question, at the same time that I'm pretty aware that there's a lot of activity in the social sciences, and so, which comes to us in a sort of ad hoc way. So to the extent that I'm missing key things in the literature, please feel free to highlight them for me. But my general sense here is that diaspora studies are not new, obviously. Lizelle mentioned that Yossi Shane was through here earlier this week. I mean, there are people that have been studying political involvement of the old diasporas for a long time now. I think that there's something new about diasporas, though, that I'm sure all of you who are interested in the subject are confronting now. And this may be one way of encapsulating the difference between the new and the old diasporas, that you have the old concept of the exile community, a community that was temporarily outside of the place of citizenship. Whereas today we have this phenomenon of what I think is more appropriately called external citizens, and one premise to this new phenomenon is the fact of permanence, or of at least cycling migration, so that external citizens are not necessarily waiting to return to the homeland after having been forced therefrom. And so I think there's something new to consider here, in addition to the fact that the old diasporas, it was a limited population of communities that qualified as diasporas, and now I think we've seen the emergence of many more, so that really any country or group that has a significant population of out migrants now qualifies generally as as a diaspora, although again, those of you who are working in this in the social science, I'd be delighted to hear if there's a more formal definition that deviates from that. And then the paper and the talk is I'm gonna focus on external voting as a barometer of external citizenship in the diasporas. And that this is, the title of the paper may need a little explanation, but I look at voting as a way of perfecting political diaspora and the political participation of external citizen populations in homeland political processes. So, what the paper does is first survey practices relating to external voting and documents the, I think, dramatic expanded acceptance of external voting, so that there is now, I'm not sure I can safely say, I haven't tallied up the numbers, but it may be now the majority practice that non-resident citizens are able to vote in homeland national political elections. And here's a partial list of those countries in which external citizens can vote in their country of residence through absentee ballots or at consulates. So that it's now facilitated. It's a facilitated participation, as opposed to some states where external citizens have the franchise, but to exercise it have to return home. The two most prominent examples of that are Israel and Taiwan, so that external citizens of Israel and Taiwan have the vote, but they can't exercise it from their place of residence. So we have this interesting phenomenon, especially with Israel, of plane loads of non-resident citizens flying home, often subsidized by, I think subsidized sometimes by political elements to anesthetize in the homeland. We also have some countries with a conditional extension of the franchise, so that if one is non-resident for a sustained period of time, you lose rights of political participation in homeland politics. In Germany, United Kingdom, and Canada are prominent examples of that conditional participation. And then there are some holdout states that do not allow, or as a general matter, don't extend rights of political participation to external citizens, although almost all states now, in some cases, allow it. It's traditionally been the case, for instance, that diplomats who are posted abroad are entitled to participate in their national elections. A country like South Africa, for instance, if you're even just studying abroad, you can vote in homeland elections. So even in these countries where there's no general right for external citizens to participate politically, there's some cases and sometimes quite broad exceptions to that. Well, I want to return to explaining the holdout cases a little later in the talk, because I think they're explainable. They're each explainable in ways that don't make them less typical, that make them not untypical of the general trend. So we've got those trends, which include recent additions to countries that in the past had not permitted external voting, which now do permit it. Those trends are unlikely to be reversed. There's a ratchet effect in place here, so that once external citizens are extended voting rights with one fairly minor exception, there's no case of them then thereafter being deprived of the right once it's extended to them, so that this has been a unidirectional trend. And prominent recent examples of external citizens exercising their rights included Italian elections last year, in which voters in Canada made the difference in the defeat of Silvio Berlusconi's government in Italy, and then U.S. presidential election in 2000, although it's not possible, the way that the balloting was done in Florida, it's not possible to isolate external voters as the tipping community, but there's a good chance that it was external voters that made the difference in Florida, and thus in the election, the general election. There are two mechanisms for channeling the participation of external voters. Two primary models. The first is what I call a simulated representation, and that is where external voters cast their ballots in their last place of residence in their homeland country. So any of you who are Americans, if you move abroad, you are guaranteed by federal law right to vote in presidential elections. Those votes are counted in your state of last residence, which is why which was what happened in Florida. So you're not processed discretely. And the other model here is what I call discrete representation, where external voters are given separate representation. So that in several countries now, including Italy, which is prominent in the elections last year, but there are other examples. Colombia is one, Croatia is another, in which external voters had their own representative. So it's in effect a district of citizens living abroad. And there's some interesting developments, and I'm mostly in much of my work I'm focused on U.S. citizenship and citizenship theory as applied in the U.S. context. There are some interesting developments on the U.S. side, including the fact that now in the parties there's something called the Democrats abroad, who send delegates to the National Party Convention, discreetly represented as such. It's unlikely that in the U.S. constitutional system there'll ever be discrete representation in the federal government for reasons having to do with the path-dependent constitutional regime. But one also finds, especially in the European context, the emergence of so-called councils of citizens living abroad, which has in some case been either supplementary or a way station to full political participation. So a discrete form of representation that may not be in the form of parliamentary representation. Then there's, along the same lines, the possibility of tiered proportional representation, so that even where external citizens are extended full rights of political participation, it may not be on a basis of full equality. So it may not be on a one-person, one-vote basis that rights of participation are extended. And this is, I think, this is quite interesting from a normative perspective, and I'm going to turn back to that at the end of the talk. Now, what explains the wider acceptance of external citizen voting? Well, it's the same motivation that has led to a dramatically enhanced acceptance of dual citizenship, and that is that sending states now understand that it's in their interest to cement diaspora relationships. That's usually with an economic motivation, but dual citizenship, and then on top of that, external citizen voting rights are seen as a way to cement the relationship. Dual citizenship in particular, and then as a manifestation of the political weight of the external citizen populations, that they now have, because of economic relations with the homeland, they have political heft, and that by way of exercising that heft, they've been able to secure these expanded rights of political participation. That said, it's not been without some objection, and this we see both in the politics of some sending states and also in political theory. What I see is three basic objections to external citizen voting. The first is that such voting will be irresponsible and or uninformed. That irresponsible in the sense that external citizen voters won't live with the consequence of their votes, uninformed because they're not around, and so that they won't be exercising the franchise on the basis of full information. So those are two important objections. There's an objection that external, or it's more by way of an explanation rather than an objection that's usually expressed, but that external citizen voting will be undisciplined, that it represents change, it's a wild card, and that it represents a threat to entrenched ruling regimes. And then the third objection works from logistical issues, that especially in where one's looking at large external citizen populations, for instance Mexican nationals in the United States, that it'll be too difficult to administer, and that there'll be an increased risk of fraud in the exercise of the franchise by external citizens. I think as a law professor, I don't shy from normative analysis. It's part of our way of looking at things. I don't see too much to these objections. So with respect to whether external citizen voting will be irresponsibly exercised, I think the strongest answer is that external citizens do live with the consequences of homeland governance these days. So there's a variety of interests that external citizens may have in homeland governance. And most of these don't really require elaboration, but in many cases, external citizens will be subject to homeland governance with respect to these categories. Remittance policies, obviously much more important in recent years. Diplomatic protection, here interesting case in the United States with the Mexican nationals in the U.S. Question is, how is the homeland government going to go to bat for them with the government in their country of residence? Social welfare policy, this is interesting if one looks at the diaspora from the north to not all the way south, but for instance, Americans who are on Social Security who go live in Mexico now in increasing numbers have an obvious interest in Social Security policy, for instance, in addition to taxes. Many citizens, external citizens, are subject to taxes, Americans again being a good example. And then I think that maybe the best way of answering this objection is that the interest is demonstrated by participation itself. That if external citizens don't have an interest in homeland governance, they're not going to bother to vote. And we've seen that in several recent elections in which the external citizen voter turnout has been extremely low. And in this case, I'm a pretty big believer in rational voting behavior, and it's likely to be marginally more difficult to exercise the franchise as an external citizen. And if you really don't have an interest in what's going on back home, then you're probably not going to take the time. You're not going to bother. Uninformed, this I think is pretty easily addressed in the face of globalization. So you have global dispersion of media, external citizen voters have access to multiple channels of information. And in fact, in some cases, they may have better access to information than homeland voters, to the extent that they're less likely to be subject to any sort of filtered political media. So this, I think, is a pretty tenuous objection now to external citizen voting. There may be sort of a Republican argument that political participation is only truly informed when it's in the context of face-to-face community. And even that is that objection is diminished in the face of large diaspora communities. So that if you're living in Jackson Heights, Queens, and you're of South Asian extraction, it's not a good example because India is one of the holdouts. I'm not sure about Pakistan, but in any case, one does find these transplanted diaspora communities in which one doesn't miss even those face-to-face interactions. Mexicans in the United States are going to be a better example of that. Undisciplined, this is all about preserving the status quo. One sees the objection that external citizens are going to be a swing vote, that they're going to decide the election, and that there's something somehow inherently objectionable about that. Really ties into the trope about irresponsible voting. Do we want people who are living here to be deciding the government, who we live with, the government that we're going to have to live with on an everyday basis, whereas those folks over there just don't have to deal with it. I'm not sure that there's much to these arguments, and I guess I highlight the swing vote objection because I see it really as a more palatable way of saying we're worried that we're going to lose. We, ruling regime, are going to lose if the vote's extended to external citizen populations. And although I haven't done the statistical correlation here, my sense is that there's a correlation between one-party rule and the absence of external citizen voting. Zimbabwe is a good example of a recent case involving controversy over whether external citizens could vote. In that case, pretty obvious which way they would go, that they would, because it's a large external citizen population that one assumes would be unfriendly to the ruling government there, that this would be a threat to the ruling regime. And I think this is a pretty good explanation at sort of a lower level of volume for why it took Mexico some time to extend the possibility of voting to its diaspora population, even after it had accepted dual citizenship, so that it was considered, it was an issue beyond accepting dual citizenship. And the case there, although I'm not an expert in Mexican politics, it was when the PRI was still in place there, and there was concern that the population of Mexicans resident in the U.S. would go against the ruling regime there. So I don't think this really works as a normative objection to external citizen voting. And then we have logistical arguments, which I think again are often a cover for concern that external citizens are going to vote against governments in power. There's no evidence that these objections have any traction, that they've played out in any way on the ground. So there are no notable cases of logistical issues, the specter of full participation on the part of some external citizen communities, again, Mexico and the United States being an interesting example, would pose some logistical challenges. So that if you had the 5 million Mexican citizens in the United States eligible to vote in Mexican elections, if they all voted, that might pose some logistical issues, but really but ones that can be managed, mostly just through budget, through extending some resources to the question. So I don't think this objection has much weight either. There's there have been some particular objections to external citizen voting in the context of dual citizenship. At least these are objections that I've heard from some of my colleagues in the legal academy who are dealing with issues relating to dual citizenship, which has been the subject of some interest among law professors, and especially what I would call liberal nationalist commentators on the question are uncomfortable with the idea of dual citizens exercising voting privileges in both countries of citizenship. And these objections, there are two lines here. One is that dual citizens will be diverted from deeper political engagement. That is, that they're going to spread themselves too thinly with respect to the expenditure of their political energies. And I think this is a particular concern, and most of the legal academics who are looking at this, it's through the lens of the U.S. situation, that if Colombian citizens are paying too much attention to politics back in Colombia, they're really not going to be able to fully engage in politics in the United States. The answer to this is that it's not, we don't have zero-sum energies here, that we all have various commitments to various collectivities, and just because you're paying attention and participating in your homeland politics doesn't necessarily detract from your participation in the politics in your place of residence. And again, I don't have the empirical data here. One might even expect that those who are politically engaged in one polity will be more politically engaged than the average in their place of residence, because they're generally politically engaged. The other objection is that dual citizen voting violates equality norms, in the sense of you're getting 2 votes where mono citizens are only getting 1. This was actually a major objection to accepting dual citizenship in the context of quite heated debates in Germany on citizenship reform. Again, I think it's a complete red herring. It doesn't result in inequality within the confines of each polity, because if you're dual U.S. and Mexican citizen, you're not getting 2 votes in the U.S. context. And in fact, if you were deprived of your rights of political participation in one or the other polity, you would be disadvantaged in that context. It would result in inequality in the other direction. And then my other answer to this it may seem like a crude answer, but life is unfair. I mean, I like to bring in memberships in civil society in this context, that some of us have various associational attachments which advantage us in various ways, and that's just the way it is. you can't really do anything about it. And in fact, in the context of dual citizenship, external rights of political participation are really the least of it. If my neighbor is Irish and American, then she's going to have rights of employment, and residence, and other rights, not just in Ireland, but the entire European Union, and that's going to be much more valuable to her than the right to vote in Irish national elections. Again, not a good example because Ireland's one of the holdouts, but voting is not necessarily that valuable a right when one looks at other rights of dual citizenship. And so really the objection, to the extent that it has any force, really has to be applied against dual citizenship in general, and not just the rights that come with it from the perspective of political participation. Another part of this equation, which takes the focus away from rights of the franchise, are rights involving campaign to contribute to campaigns, to make campaign contributions, and so even in some of the holdout states where external citizens are not permitted to vote in homeland elections, they're allowed to make contributions to homeland, to candidates in homeland elections, which again may be more important than the right to vote. So that I think those are my answers to the objections. At the same time, I think one explanation for these objections, especially among political theorists, and this is where I think where external voting I think is really quite interesting. One can explain these objections by looking at the challenge that external citizens pose, I think, in a very fundamental way to liberal political theory. And I think there are really two respects, again, at a very fundamental level, in which external citizen voting challenges established liberal political theory. And the first is that it decouples territory and governance. And here got Michael Walter's a favorite target of mine on these, because I think he most eloquently represents really the received wisdom of liberal political theory. He, in fairly categorical terms, makes the connection between territory and governance as being a fundamental one. So the link between people and land is a crucial feature of national identity. The focus of political life can never be established elsewhere. This is from spheres of, I think it's from spheres of justice. Men and women are either subject to the state's authority or they are not, and if they are subject, they must be given a say, and ultimately an equal say in what the authority does. And sort of from both directions, I think one can use a political diaspora and, in particular, formal political participation to question these bedrock principles of liberal political theory. And the focus of political life can never be established elsewhere. I think that's being proven wrong on the ground in a pretty dramatic way. And then, to the extent that it is proven wrong, so that to the extent that men and women are subject to a state's authority, even if it's not on a territorial basis, then they must be given a say, and ultimately an equal say in what the authority does, which is an argument from a rights perspective for external citizen voting population, and maybe beyond. More recent work from Shayla Beneby, who's doing some very interesting work on citizenship theory now. Although there's been some interesting evolution, I think, from a Waltzerian approach, liberal political theorists still can't get beyond this, what Benedict calls the crucial link between democratic self-governance and territorial representation. And I think it's because once you get beyond it, the whole notion of democratic self-governance and of the equality norm can't withstand this challenge. So that also fundamental to liberal political theory is, as we see in the second quote from Walter, that one has to have an equal say in what an authority does. And this is quite fundamental to self-governance. But what do you do when you get to when one looks at external citizen populations? And here I think this is maybe the question that is still, in terms of the practice, the most important question that is yet to be resolved. I think we're clearly seeing a move towards accepting external political rights for external citizen voting populations. The question is on what terms. And I think in some contexts, there may be a pretty strong argument for what I call tiered representation. That is, a representation of external citizens on a non-equal basis. In Ireland and Hungary are two interesting examples. In neither case does one yet find external citizen voting rights, and the reason is because one's looking at very large diaspora populations. For Ireland, I think the diaspora population is almost as large as the resident population, and then there may be, this gets back to the question of interest. I think it's safe to say that on average, a resident citizen is going to have greater interest in homeland governance than the external citizen is, and that might be a justification for some lower level of representation. It's not an argument for no representation, because external citizens will have some interest on average in homeland governance. But it may be an argument, especially in the face of large diaspora population, for tiered representation. But that takes us back around to what, it's got to be an equal say. Well, how can we, this violates the received wisdom of one person, one vote. At the same time that I think it's, there's a justification, at least in some context. And so what do you do with that? What do you do with the liberal political paradigm in the face of tiered representation, at the same time that you can't deny representation altogether? Because, again, to work from Walzer, these external citizens will be subject to the state's authority in some way. And then this goes from another direction, again, also posing a challenge to the political liberalism, to the extent that non-citizen, non-residents are subject to a state's authority. On what basis can one deny them some say in a country's governance? And this gets us a little beyond the topic here today, but as a thought experiment, it's not so easy to repulse the proposition that everyone in the world, regardless of citizenship, should be able to vote for a president of the United States, to the extent that everybody in the world is now affected by the result of that decision. I have, in a piece that I have coming out, I put this down just as a proposition, and my editor said, well, you can't say that, that's crazy. But there's actually a column in the Washington Post that was proposed, and again, just by way of a thought experiment. So as long as we have a Washington Post op-ed piece to cite to, it gives your argument some credibility. But back to the topic of political diaspora, I think looking forward, there's this key question on the mode of representation. Although I think that it's quite clear that the trend towards greater acceptance is likely to continue, and there's very little probability of it being reversed in the face of the incentive that some of these states have for cementing economic ties. And then also to the extent that this political participation is now being framed in terms of rights. But this is a big hurdle. I think it was only recently that external citizen political participation would be processed as a matter of rights. And that is now happening, and it's interesting developments in the Council of Europe, which I referenced in the paper, in which it's being approached in those terms. The Zimbabwe elections in 2005, another particular case where the question of what rights external citizens should have was framed as a matter of rights. And then to the extent that we sort of get over that barrier and that that participation is conceived of as a matter of rights, again, I see very little probability of the development being reversed. On the ground, though, I think there's still a big question about once these rights of political participation are extended to external citizens, whether they avail themselves to them. And I think this really end up being a litmus test for the significance of external citizenship in the context of the new diasporas. And there's been evidence in both directions here. So there have been elections in which external citizens have participated at a high level, and then there have been others in which the participation has been extremely low. And the most dramatic example of that is the Mexican presidential elections of last year, in which around 50,000 Mexican citizens resident in the United States voted in those national elections out of an estimated 5 to 6 million who were eligible. And so it's possible that even as these rights of political participation are extended to external citizens, that they won't be exercised. And I think that says something about the nature of the new diasporas. I think it also says something about the strength of the state going forward. The rise of dual citizenship and of external citizen political rights is being used as evidence of the continued vitality of the state. And it's true at one level that citizenship is all about membership in the state, and so to the extent that people avail themselves to the possibility of dual citizenship, then that can hardly be used as an argument that the state is withering away. But to the extent that they're not active as citizens, and political participation here, I think, is as good a test as any, then it may nonetheless be the case that even with the rise of dual citizenship and the extension of political rights, that we at least don't have an argument, we don't have evidence for the resurgence of the state, and maybe even an argument that this is further evidence of its decline as an associative institution, insofar as we see very low levels of activity. I've got a book coming out in December which focuses on American identity, which is along these lines. That is, that dual citizenship can be used as evidence for the end of citizenship rather than for its revival. So this is my first opportunity to plug in the nice cover that they gave me. So I'll take advantage of that now. But so in any case, I'm happy to take questions or challenges. And I don't know how it works in your disciplines, but in law we invite challenges, so if anybody has thoughts or.
I sort of missed what the main thesis of the book is then.
Of the book, it's particular to American citizenship, but the argument is that one can look at citizenship status as a way of proving the unsustainability of American national identity. That there's no way to draw the boundaries of the American national community in terms of status in the face of globalization to coincide with any actual community on the ground. Which is, and the argument is to a large extent peculiar to the peculiar challenges of American national identity, but I think that there's some broader applications in arguing that citizenship, that membership in the state is a declining institution generally. My current project now is looking at international law of citizenship and how international law is starting to dictate to states their citizenship practices in a way, again, that will result increasingly in the detachment of organic community from formal community in a way that I think inevitably undermines the state as an associative identity. And diaspora, again, is a little tricky in the context that I think it's typically thought of with a sending state and a state-based identity. And so it may present a counter-argument, although I think the response there is that you end up with a diaspora that's detached from the state. You can have a diaspora that's identified with a homeland state. And even if the diaspora identity is strong, that doesn't necessarily mean that the state-based identity is a strong one. And so this has not been a sort of a systematic study on my part, but I was in Armenia summer before last, and I saw what I saw as a pretty clear detachment between the very strong diaspora identity and then the state, which was sort of, we don't want to have anything to do with it, or this is not us, and so I don't think it's an inconsistent trend that we see the strength of diaspora identity at the same time that may not translate into a strengthening state.
I just wanted to quickly ask about Mexico, because you said only 50,000 roughly came over, voted.
Right.
Was that not due because people had to travel to Mexico?
No, they
Or
did. You
different?
did.
Because I don't remember.
No, it's now. It was the case in the last presidential election that they had to travel.
Oh, they had to. Okay.
That was changed, although it was a very controversial amendment to the Mexican electoral law that they could do it by, I believe, by absentee ballot. Although there's still some logistical, complications. You have to have been, here I can't sort of give you the full details, but the registration process was tricky. So that the Mexican citizen population in the United States is, I think, estimated around 10 million. And only half of those were eligible to participate because of a registration requirement, the details of which I can't give you. So it wasn't seamless. At the same time, and so some have tried to explain it that way, at the same time that the rate was so low, and the expectations have been pretty high. I mean, this has been, the objections on all three of the primary objections had been advanced in the context of Mexican domestic politics very strenuously. And one of them was, well, you can't have 5 million or 10 million people voting in Chicago and Los Angeles and New York because it's just going to be a nightmare, and who knows, I mean, all hell may break loose, and you'll get political violence and fraud, and then to have this tiny number participate, I mean, again, the jury's still out on this.
Yeah, I think it's logical, basically, expectation versus what actually happened. So I kind of understand what really the disconnect was.
What way of explaining it, there are these, some say it was this, because the process wasn't fully facilitated, it wasn't made that easy, but that would explain, a participation rate of 20%, but with the percentages, it's around 1%. And there've been other cases of very low turnout rates that, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but in Colombian elections, there was a turnout of 2,000 out of some much larger number of eligible voters, which again makes sense if one, well, in two respects. One could process it in two ways. One would be to say, well, they don't really have an interest in homeland governance. And the other would be a little more refined, which is they don't have an interest in national political contests. Now, they may have various interests in homeland governance broadly defined. In fact, one interesting development in Mexico recently has been a big push for voting rights in subnational elections in Mexico. So that, and again, here I can't give you the full details, but I think it's clearly not a general right to participate in the state elections in Mexico, but there's an increasing interest in that participation. I think because that may be, for some purposes, more important to the external citizen interest than the national political elections, in terms of, for instance, the very interesting phenomenon of the hometown associations in effect funding public works projects in Mexico at the local level, at which level local and state political contests are more important than the national ones. So,
I have another question.
Yeah, sure.
Regarding Germany. I wonder whether you have an explanation for Germany has a law that you cannot have dual citizenship despite the fact that one of your parents is German if the mother is German and not the father if you're born before 1972. And I was trying to work out why they would have a cutoff date like that. Whether this
I don't know the specifics of that. You
retirement
find
or
in
something.
citizenship laws, and you see this in U.S. citizenship law as well, there'll be amendments to the nationality law that take force only on a prospective basis. And so it was gender discriminatory before 1972.
Yeah, so in
Yeah.
born in 1972 and after, if one of the parents would be German, and
Right.
if you're born abroad, of course, you could have the passport as well.
Right.
But if you're born before, only if it was the father.
Yeah, well, it was a much more prevalent practice. This is something that's been changing slowly since the beginning of the 20th century. It used to be, the 19th century used to be the prevailing practice that citizenship only descended through on a patrilineal basis. So it's true in U.S. citizenship law as well. And slowly, this is interesting because international law has played a part in this, that although there's still some holdouts, not surprisingly, in the Islamic world, but most states now majority practice that there's it's no longer discriminatory on that basis. But I assume, without knowing the specifics of Germany, I assume that Germany had that, and then in the wake of the international as well as other forces, changed the law, but on a prospective basis only. And the reason that states do that is that they don't want to be faced with depending on the numbers, they don't want to be faced with sort of, oh, I've got citizenship. Oh, I've got citizenship. I mean, it's interesting though, Germany's...
But the birth rate is going down.
Well, Germany's quite interesting.
Germany's
Germany's quite interesting because even it was... Dual citizenship was a very hotly contested issue in a way that it's hard for Americans to imagine with respect to the 1999 debate on citizenship. And obviously it takes place against the backdrop of large Turkish and Islamic population. And the result there was, as a formal matter, still not to accept dual citizenship. Although it is possible on a discretionary basis for Germans, in some cases, to hold alternate citizenship. And that's done at the level, actually, interestingly, of the Länder, of the German states. And my understanding is that that discretion is being exercised on an increasingly favorable basis, especially with respect to native-born Germans who leave Germany and acquire citizenship in another country. So for a German who moves to the United States and naturalizes as a German, as long as they can show some continuing ties to Germany, they're in most cases able to maintain the German citizenship. That, of course, sort of makes, well, Germans can keep,
Right.
where the Turkish citizens, and as a formal matter, those who were born, the major innovation of the 1999 reform there was to give birthright citizenship to, in many cases, the children of long-term Turkish immigrants. German citizenship at birth, but they will still, those German citizens will still be subject to an election requirement at the age of 21. So if they hold both German and another citizenship as a formal matter, they'll have to choose when they turn 21. My opinion on that is that by the time those children turn 21, this will no longer be an issue. But Germany is quite an interesting context for looking at issues of dual citizenship. But there, I mean, my take generally is that the door has been open to dual citizenship as a matter of an administrative practice. It's being more accepted. It was framed as a matter of human rights in the 1999 debate, which is interesting. There's now a European Convention on Nationality, which in some cases requires the recognition of birthright dual citizenship. And so there are a lot of interesting developments on those questions.
Your example of the political mobilization of the Jewish community here to vote in Israel in elections brings to mind kind of this other issue, I think, about sort of ethics and sort of laws around campaigns, right? And that that legal infrastructure is very much sort of state embedded. You know, states say this is what's legal and what's not legal to do in a campaign situation. But this is transnational voting, so it's kind of, therein sort of lies another one of those examples where this sort of transnational behavior, you know, is somewhat problematized by the sort of very state way of looking at law, that, you know, defining what's allowable and what's not in an election context. And I wonder if anybody sort of raises that as one of the concerns for expatriate voting, that they can be mobilized, they can perhaps be mobilized in ways that back home, you know, in a foreign land, they could be mobilized in ways that back home might be conceived of as illegal types of ways of mobilization.
Yeah, no.
Therefore more manipulated or influenced.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, Israel is an example where one could make quite a strong argument that those who are resident in Israel are going to feel the consequence of the results of elections in a very different way from an externally resident Israeli citizen. And so, and the ethics, I hesitate, I have some vague recollection that these flights back to Israel were subsidized, they were chartered, and so they were subsidized in some way. And you know, it's a problem. And Israel, the Middle East, I find, as an international law person, is an area just to bracket, because it's a throwback to the old world, and you can't really use it to demonstrate anything sort of going forward. But it would be a context in one I could see a justification, both because there's a large population of externally resident citizens, and because the the stakes are so high in a territorially contingent way that one could imagine not granting them any rights of participation or on a tiered basis. And then the law is, I mean, we've got to go back to Israel, and that, I mean, I guess what it does is it poses a threshold to participation, which might be a good thing. But in the Israeli context, it may not be enough to filter out those who don't really have an interest in what's going on back home. In a more typical situation, you think the plane fare, well, you know, unless you've really got a stake in what's going on back home in terms of your taxes and remittances and other things, you wouldn't shell out the $500 or whatever it is that's going to take you to get home. Israel, because of everything that's sort of particular to the situation there, that may not filter out those who have attenuated or non-material interest in what's going on back home. That was okay to keep going?
Yeah, I was just
Let's
going to
follow
use
it
a
up.
follow-up question. What is the